You know, up to now, the approaches you've seen have used a localizer or localizer type nav aid which transmits just a single course. Well, they give you accurate approach course guidance, and that is a good thing when you're trying to find a runway in low visibility. But most localizer type approaches usually only serve one runway at only one airport. Is there something with more flexibility? You bet there is. Dum-da-da-dum, da-da-dum-dum-da-da. The VOR is now making its grand entrance as an approach nav aid. Is a VOR elegant? Well, no. What we're really talking about here is the mud of approach navigation. You know, no fancy breeding, but VOR approaches are lick your hand friendly. And like most much, you'll probably find lots of them in your aerial neighborhoods. So why? Because VORs are relatively easy to use and they give you lots of flexibility. And you know, any one of those 360-degree radials that go around there can be used as an approach course. So VOR approaches serve hundreds of airports that could not support an approach with, say, a fancy pedigree. And like your friendly local mutts, you'll see lots of differences in each one of these. You know, with most localizer-based approaches, the nav aid is right smack dab on the airport. But when you're looking at VOR approaches, the VOR station can be almost anywhere, as long as it's within 30 miles of the airport. So let's take a look at some of the differences you'll see with VOR approaches. For example, let's start with the VOR, or GPS Runway 1 approach, happens to be to Burlington, Vermont. Now, many folks would regard this as the classic VOR configuration. That's because the VOR and the final approach course are both on the same side of the airport, and the VOR is pretty close to the airport. Now in this particular case, if you look down here, the missed approach point is only 3.9 nautical miles from the VOR, and what that means is you have really accurate navigation on the final approach segment, and that's important because that's where you have the least obstruction clearance. Now for the final approach segment, the FAA requires a primary protected area that's only 2 miles wide at the VOR and expands to 5 miles wide at 30 nautical miles from the VOR. So when you have an approach where the VOR is close to the airport, the area they have to consider for obstructions is smaller than when the VOR is further away. And what that means to you is you'll usually have lower MDAs and visibility minimums with an approach setup like this than you would with an approach setup like this. And by the way, the lowest height above touchdown and visibility minimum permitted for a VOR approach is 250 feet and 1/2 mile. That's the lowest permitted, and golly, that's almost as good as an ILS. Now let's go back and take another look at that Burlington approach. In this case, notice that the VORTAC is used for both the initial approach fix, and that's the fix on which the procedure turn is based, and the final approach fix. And that really makes for a simple nav radio setup because in this case the only thing you need your number 2 nav for is for the missed approach holding fix. Now DME is not required for this approach, but you could use DME or an IFR GPS to identify the missed approach point. But if you don't have either one of those, then you just time it. Now here is something else that's interesting. Because this approach has a runway number in the title, in this case runway 1, you know that this approach has straight-in minimums to runway 1. In this case, the final approach course arrives on the 036 radial, and then you have a 26-degree angle to runway 1. And by the way, that's just barely within the 30-degree maximum allowed for a straight-in approach, but it's doable. But it would be a good thing to note when you're doing your pre-briefing for this approach. Now, VOR approaches actually will seldom line up exactly with the runway, but if the final approach course did not come within 30 degrees of the runway heading, there would be a letter in the approach name, such as VOR Alpha, instead of runway number. Now let's take a look at the approach at Castleton Regional Airport in North Dakota. In this particular case, the VORTAC and the final approach segment are all on the same side of the airport. And also in this case, the Fargo VORTAC, if you look at this, is 15.7 miles. We can add it up down here. 15.7 miles total from the airport or the missed approach point. And what that means is the protected area will be considerably wider than we saw for the approach at Burlington. Now, the FAA says that the optimum length of the final approach segment is only 5 miles and the maximum is 10 miles. So in this case, the VORTAC is too far away to use it for the final approach fix, so they had to create another fix on the approach to make a final approach fix. In this case, if you look at the plan view, you can see that that would really be a challenge otherwise, because there's no other nav aids to use around here. There's no VORs for cross radials, no NDBs or marker beacons, so the only option left to them was using DME or GPS as a substitute, and that's how they defined the final approach fix. Now, if you go back up to the top up here, you'll see that that's why they have DME or GPS in the name of the approach, because as you already know, when navigation equipment is listed in the name of the approach, it's required equipment for that approach. Now, and since you have to have DME to identify the final approach fix, they don't even bother to fill out the table down here for timing for the missed approach. You just use that DME reading. Now, another variation on this off-airport VOR theme is when the VOR is on the opposite side of the airport from the final approach segment. Now, here is an example. It's VOR GPS runway 14 approach, happens to be to Dothan, Alabama. But as you can see in this case, the Wiregrass VORTAC is southeast of the airport, but the final approach course comes in northwest of the airport on what would that be, the 328 radial. Now, in this case also, Bitsy intersection here is the final approach fix, and since the 048 radial of Cairns is available to identify Bitsy, you don't need DME for this approach. Now, let's take a look at another one. In this case, we'll look at the VOR runway 28 approach, happens to be to Block Island, Rhode Island. In this case, the VOR is right smack dab on the airport. In fact, if you go look at the sketch view down here, you can see it's right beside the runway. Well, in this approach, the Sandy Point VOR DME facility is the missed approach point, so there's no timing required for it. But look at this. Where in the heck is the final approach fix? You notice there's no Maltese cross there anywhere in this profile view. Well, as you may recall, when the nav aid is on the airport, the final approach fix is the point where you intercept the approach course inbound after you've done the procedure turn. Well, that interception point is not at a fixed spot, so there is no published final approach fix, so therefore there is no Maltese cross on this chart. Now, on this approach also, by the way, there is no intermediate approach segment because you go right from the initial approach segment to the final approach segment. Now, you can also see in this case there is a 4 nautical mile DME step-down fix on this approach, and that lets you get to an 80-foot lower MDA. So you can see now you get 80 feet lower due to that step-down fix. Well, by now, as you've seen, VOR approaches may not win the best of breed ribbons, but being much, they are versatile and pilot friendly. The only thing is, they just can't lick the back of your hand.